Hey everybody, welcome to the show. This is the Otherppl podcast, a weekly program featuring in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. I'm Brad Listi and I'm in Los Angeles. It's good to be with you. I appreciate you listening. Hope you're doing okay out there. Happy holidays, if that's your thing. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on social media, Bluesky, Instagram, and TikTok. So my guest today is Tony Tulathimutte, author of a new novel called Rejection.
Rejection is like such a neurotic process because, especially if it's something that you really want, like a person, for example, and you put yourself out there, make yourself vulnerable to, make some kind of proposition to them romantically, and then they say no, then immediately the first thing that's going to come to your mind is, well, why? And this puts you in the mind of having to then come up with a kind of theory of mind for them, right? Where it's just like, what was going through their head? What did they see in me that made them want to reject me? And then you have to take this possibly totally, fake and definitely artificial idea of what they were thinking and react to it in yourself. So all of a sudden, this sort of comfortable roost of self-possession that you've been in for, most days, day in and day out, is just kind of despoiled by this process of like having to see yourself through this this lens of a fiction that you invented.
All right, that was Tony Tulathimutte, author of the novel and stories entitled Rejection. It is available now from William Morrow and Company. Rejection was longlisted for the National Book Award in Fiction, and it has been named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times. This is a superb book, an uproarious and subversive, even harrowing at times, novel and stories about a cast of intricately linked characters whose lives and relationships have been thrown into chaos by rejection. Rejection is a fiercely intelligent work of fiction and an incredibly deft exploration of what it means to be rejected by lovers, by friends, by society, and by oneself. I had a great and fascinating conversation with Tony Tulathimutte. This is his second time on the program. He first appeared in episode 409 in April of 2016. My talk with Tony Tulathimutte is coming up in just a bit. A reminder before we get going that I do a weekly email newsletter. You can sign up over at Substack. I would love it if you did. And if you're in the holiday spirit, if you listen to this show regularly, if you get something from it, if you value the work that I do and you want to help me keep doing it, I hope you will consider joining the Otherppl Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. Once again, that's patreon.com/otherpplpod. Today's episode is brought to you by Tin House, publisher of The World with Its Mouth Open, the debut story collection by Zahid Rafiq. In 11 stories, The World with Its Mouth Open follows the inner lives of people in Kashmir as they walk the uncertain terrain of their days, fractured from years of war. This is an original and powerful debut, and I will be speaking with Zahid Rafiq on this podcast in the weeks ahead. The World with Its Mouth Open is the official December pick of the Otherppl Book Club, my book club. For more on it and to sign up, visit otherppl.com. Once again, the official pick for December is the debut story collection by Zahid Rafiq. It is called The World with Its Mouth Open, available from Tin House. All right, my guest once again is Tony Tulathimutte. His new novel is called Rejection, and it is out there now, available from William Morrow and Company. Tony Tulathimutte is also the author of a debut novel called Private Citizens. His work has appeared in the Paris Review, N+1, The Nation, The New Republic, and The New York Times. He is the recipient of an O. Henry Award and a Whiting Award, and he runs the writing class Crit in Brooklyn. I'm very happy to welcome Tony Tulathimutte back onto this show for a second time and to talk with him about this book of his, which is quite something. So let's get to it. Here I am with Tony Tulathimutte, and his new novel in stories, one more time, is called Rejection.
When I was still at Iowa in grad school and miserable, didn't want to work on the book I was working on, which is Private Citizens. Yeah, it was just kind of a form of procrastination almost. I wanted to write about rejection, and I usually don't really start with like a title and theme because I find that like the work that comes out can get kind of schematic or sort of title driven in the way that like when you read an Onion article, sometimes you read the headline and then the article just kind of recapitulates the headline over and over again. So, I try to avoid that usually, but I just knew this time that that's what I wanted the subject to be. So I was writing all these different kinds of pieces like, vignettes and like a glossary. I was doing a bunch of like research in like social sciences, weirdly, and I didn't know what form I wanted it to take. And then I just put it aside eventually. Got back to it in like 2017 when my agent like shouted at me to actually focus up on a book, and was focused on it from there till when I sold it around like 2022.
Do you know why rejection, like the topic of rejection, was interesting to you?
Well, yeah, obviously. The obvious reason, which is that, I've just been through a lot of it. I mean, this, like, just as a writer, it's just something that you have to inure yourself to, or you're not going to make it, right? And that's just on the professional side. I mean, on just like the personal level, like, yeah, I have 8 or 9 different axes in which, like, I feel, generally slighted, rejected in this kind of like intractable way. Don't really need to get into them, but rest assured I know of what I speak.
Well, I was thinking about this. I mean, it's kind of impossible to read your book without thinking about rejection and how it's like affected like your own life. And I was wondering to myself, like, are writers more inured to rejection? Are we better practiced at it? Is rejection more of a fact of life in this line of work than it is in others?
I think that the volume of rejections writers have to get is probably a bit inordinate, right? Like, if you have a short story and you're at the very beginning of your career, few sort of publishing credits to your name, and you don't have the advantage of just sort of like, oh, I know this person and I'm going to kind of like, read their work a little more kindly or something, then yeah, you can expect to be rejected everywhere for several years. I mean, that on top of that, you're also at the beginning of your career not very good. So like, I started writing in 2001, and between then and like 2010, I kept track of every single submission. I'm a big sort of record keeper, and I racked up about 400 rejections. That's just not the kind of numbers you're going to see when you're like doing things like applying for a job or grad school or something, if you're lucky, I guess. But it's just a lot of them. But I will say that the rejections are also a lot more slight. I mean, it's usually just a form rejection, and you also come to learn that even when the rejections are personalized, you're sort of inclined to take that as an insult of some kind. Like, if you want to compliment my writing, why didn't you just accept it rather than tell me that you're rejecting it anyway? But you realize that actually they don't have to do that at all. Like, they're going out of their way to encourage you. So there are forms of rejection that you even come to sort of covet, right? Like, I think it's pretty common to see people be like, I got a nice rejection from the New Yorker or Harper's or something, and that was encouraging to me.
How did you handle it?
I didn't.
I mean,
I didn't at all. Like, I had to write a fucking literary book about it. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it is about me that makes me like preternaturally thin-skinned about it. But well, I have some guesses. But I think if people are looking for advice on how to cope or how to, outgrow or mature past rejection, like, this is not the book for them.
I think I saw you tweet or Bluesky something about how someone told you that like there was a therapist who was recommending your book to their
Yeah.
patients, and you were like, "This is not a good
Yeah, I've heard
idea."
it. I mean, a couple of times from different people, and I'm like, yeah, that just like writing the book was, in a way, like a 8-year long sustained process of wallowing. I don't think that it will. It's got therapeutic value to it. I do think that there is something incidentally therapeutic about just knowing that other people have it as bad or possibly even worse than you, are down even more horrendous than you are. But that's not the same thing as therapy.
So another thing that this book made me think about, and it's because some of the sections or stories or whatever we're going to call this, because I know the classification of this book is a bit of an open
Yeah.
question, but it's a work of connected short stories. I think is the most commonly used way of sort of categorizing it. But there are stories in the book that explicitly deal with romantic
Mhm.
rejection, and I think this is something that most people alive go through at least a few times in life. I mean, it's part of being human, except for like I guess the preternaturally blessed among us or
Yeah.
something. But
You can just say hot
there's
people.
some, yeah. Well, but I mean, yeah, even some hot people get rejected,
Yeah.
right? But it's like I don't know too many people, if any, who haven't been through it. And I guess what it makes me think, or at least, or I think maybe more accurately, what it makes me remember, because I've been married for a long
Mhm.
time, is that when you're rejected romantically, there is something so undeniably harsh about it.
Yeah.
Like, I remember having that thought. Well, I was like, "This person just doesn't like me, and they never will. Like, it's just not gonna happen." It's that feeling, when you realize you're defeated, it's not gonna happen. There's something brutal about it, I guess, is the point.
I think in your day to day life, there is this kind of like necessary psychological barrier that you have up, where you feel that your sense of like self possession comes from this idea that like I understand myself, right? Nobody has been through what I've been through, thought what I've thought. I have the kind of privileged position on the inside of my own head and my own past. So, I get me. And if other people, have a problem with that, then, you know, well, we'd have to work out and see who's right and who's wrong here. Rejection is like such a neurotic process because, especially if it's something that you really want, like a person, for example, and you put yourself out there, make yourself vulnerable to, make some kind of proposition to them romantically, and then they say no, right? Then immediately the first thing that's going to come to your mind is, well, why, right? And this puts you in the mind of having to then come up with a kind of theory of mind for them, right? Where it's just like, what was going through their head? What did they see in me that made them want to reject me? And then, that version of their mind that you came up with may or may not actually be right, right? It's very often informed by just your own fears and neuroses about how you come across to other people, and then you have to then take this possibly totally fake and definitely artificial idea of what they were thinking, and react to it in yourself, to be like, well, but that's not a valid reason, or like that's not fair, or if I could change their mind, or if I could get another chance or whatever, then maybe the outcome would be different. And these are all terrible, lines of thinking. They don't lead anywhere. They certainly don't really make it any more likely that you're going to get anywhere with them, right? But it's hard not to indulge yourself in that way. So all of a sudden, this sort of comfortable roost of self-possession that you've been in for most days, day in and day out, is just kind of despoiled by this process of like having to see yourself through this lens of a fiction that you invented.
Yeah, there's something final about it. And I guess I've been, you're on the other side of it too. There are some people that you won't consider as a romantic partner, for example. It's just not happening.
Yeah.
And I guess it sort of depends on whether or not they make an approach or like try to couple with you or ask you out or something. And you have to be the rejecter. And so when you experience it in that way, or when I've experienced in that way, there's just something sort of matter of fact about it. It isn't malicious. It's just like, yeah, I'm just not into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost never malicious, and it's very easy to forget that in most cases, it's like equally unpleasant to reject somebody as to be rejected, right? You have to feel guilty. You have to worry about how they're going to respond to your rejection, and so on, right? That social sciences reading I was doing, one of the more interesting facts I dug up was that like after somebody's rejected, people respond in all different kinds of ways to their own rejection. Like some people are like, actually, it's good that I can move on now. I've got closure. To, oh, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. But people who reject other people always report it as a negative. So it's more consistently negative, if not necessarily as intense an experience to be the rejecter. So it's like, yeah, it's bad for both people, right? And as you say, like, yes, it's final in the sense that if somebody's rejected you, and you're going to assume that there's not going to be another opportunity, that just no is no, right? So yeah, there's not another person like that. Everybody's an individual, so it does feel like this one branch of your life has been decisively pruned, right? And it's hard to move past that. And like, in a weird way, the finality of it is what makes dwelling on the rejection unending, right? That like, because you have this counterfactual now of how happy you might have been had you not been rejected, because there's nothing that can actually prove you wrong, because it hasn't happened. You can just dwell on it forever. And that's another sort of dynamic to rejection I wanted to get at in the book.
There's also like this, like, I think you're kind of speaking to this a little bit, but there's an inward complexity to rejection when you've experienced it multiple times in particular, because you get rejected and then you find yourself reflecting on the rejection, and then you find yourself cross-referencing it with the rejections of the past. And that can lead you to spiral and to kind of land really in a kind of fictional place where you're kind of making stuff up
Yeah.
about why and what happened. And it can become, I think, unproductive and even self-damaging.
Yeah, unproductive is a really mild term for it. I would say the term I would use is death spiral, but I think that like, yeah, it's really difficult to break out of that cycle because of just like the existence of your ego, right? That your ego wants to not think of itself as, in any way, there's actually a word for this, rejectitious, prone to be rejected. You want to think well of yourself, right? And so that ego part of your brain is going to be, probing for reasons why it was wrong for you to be rejected, either circumstantially or the other, by the other person's judgment. And it's usually that assessment itself that is wrong. I mean, especially when it comes to things like romance, there's not really any reason that anybody can give for rejecting that would be wrong, right? Like the only examples really I could think of would be like the sort of Pride and Prejudice kind, when it's based on like a sort of wild misunderstanding and a set of highly improbable misunderstandings between the two people, but it's not usually like that. It's usually like I just not feeling it, right? Or I don't feel the same way. And there's no arguing with that.
Rejectitious, is that the word? There are people who are like predisposed or inclined to be rejected more than others.
Oh, for sure. Actually, the really funny line I found in one of these papers, because they, it's scientific papers, they have to spell everything out really thoroughly. So they have to say things like, yes, there are people who are more prone to being rejected. It is better to be intelligent and attractive than stupid and ugly. That's literally what it says in the paper.
I feel like I've been around in my life at times people who would fall into this category. And the sensation that I recall is just of being around somebody who it's clear is desperate for connection and approval, and yet through their behavior like repels those very things.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? It's like an insecurity that is really difficult to be around.
Yeah. And right. And again, that it's your ego that's telling you like, it's not me that's wrong. It's not me that who has to change. It's not I who have to change. It's everybody else. Right. Um, and that's not going to be productive. It's going to cause you to double and triple down on the very thing that is getting you rejected. On the other hand, like sometimes other people can be wrong, right? That's another thing that makes the whole process difficult. In that, let's say that you just hold a political belief that's unpopular, but in your mind, you believe in sort of like passionately, and other people reject you on that basis. Well, obviously, if it's what I would call a bad belief, then I think that makes sense. But if it wasn't, if you were just in a social context in which everybody else happened to be wrong, then there's a way in which you could say like, yeah, that's really unfortunate, or that's it's too bad because I have a lot of other qualities, and I don't want to just pander and change my political beliefs just because it'll make people more prone to liking me. That's not having any integrity at all, right? But again, you need to have a real sober assessment of this to make sure that that's really the reason why you're being rejected. And most people, when they're right in the middle of it, are not in a position to make that assessment.
So this was obviously a subject, as you've been saying, that was of interest to you. You've had experience with it in myriad ways. Most all of us have had some experience with it somehow. And I think I want to read a quote from you. This will probably be the best way to kind of orient listeners. But you've talked about how most of what is unlikable about the characters in your book is just a convex version of my own
Mhm.
flaws. So that part was easy because I am naturally and effortlessly annoying. The hard part was trying to translate my thoughts, feelings, and experiences through the particulars of the characters and their circumstances. This book is peopled by such vivid and memorable, like painfully memorable characters. I'd love to hear you talk about that creative leap from kind of interrogating yourself and seeing the ways in which rejection has impacted you and the ways in which you're kind of obsessed with it, to then creating like a cast of characters who embody maybe different forms of rejection or the impacts of different kinds of rejection.
Yeah. I find myself in this bind often where obviously things that are going in my life are going to be of interest to me, and I really want to write about them. But if I try to do it in any kind of like undisguised, uh, direct way, I get this sort of absolute recoil. It feels um, silly or trivial, or it's not, uh, sort of, it's complicated by too many of the factors in my life. And this is why I usually go to fiction for this stuff, where I can kind of get a distance from them and recontextualize things I thought and felt in a completely different standpoint. And that enables me to talk about them clearly, right? It's a cliche to say that, like, you are making up fictions in order to sort of get to a truth, but it's a classic for a reason, right? So yeah, I think that it's always been important for me to take at least one thing about a character and make that character very, very different from me on that score. But then if they're too different, then I'm not really going to understand them or be able to feel comfortable in like presuming to speak on their behalf, in the context of fiction. So usually I also have to put a ton of myself into them, right? And that ends up being this sort of umbilical cord connecting me to them, that helps me understand why they're doing what they're doing, but just in a different set of circumstances.
And I should say, I think that's common for most writers of fiction.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
don't,
yeah. It's like a gene splicing process for most people, but I think that I the only thing that distinguishes the way that I do it, I think, is that I do a lot of baiting. I think I take a lot of what is conspicuous about me, and use that to lead with like the characterization of characters. Like, if anybody, like looks at me, they can see that I look a certain way. They can tell what race I am and things like that. And putting that into a character, this automatically, this sort of like auto-fictional assumption kicks in. And for some reason, this is more powerful for people of color than I think it is for white writers. That if you make a character the same race as you and then share a couple of other things too, it's easier to assume for some reason that it's like autobiographical fiction, right? And here, I really dialed it up to the point where I even, um, went full metafiction in the last couple of stories, and put myself in as a character, right? But that's still a fictional creation. That's not me.
Yeah, and I think like this auto-fictional assumption is riskier or has like a higher cost than a book like this, maybe.
Yeah,
Because the characters on the page are like in so much pain or are behaving in a way that falls outside of accepted norms, shall we say. And so
yeah. I mean, whenever you put anything that sort of smells like autobiographical content in line with salacious subject matter, that's the first thing that people want to know about. To what extent did this person go through the same things, or experience the same things, and put that into the book? Like, how much of it is real? I think that's just like a sort of reflexive human nosiness, and like I'm not innocent of that either. In reading, I'm constantly flipping to you know the author photo on the back of the book, and even imagining certain characters looking like that person, or going online and googling stuff and trying to do this like sort of connect the dots process. And that you're not supposed to do that if you're a critic, but I think that this is a natural thing that a lot of readers do. Now, being aware of this, I wanted to make that work in service of the book, rather than against it or distract from it, which I think explains a lot of like the Beatty and metafictional content in it.
so words that I have seen used to describe this book include filthy. Like it's many people refer to how funny it is. It's darkly funny. I don't know. Do you consider it a funny book? Were you laughing as
Oh
you read
yeah,
it?
absolutely. I mean, my number one goal in writing the book was to make it funny, and to me, and I guess my like comic sensibilities, funny does not at all preclude serious or dark. And in fact, usually the absolutely worst thing that can happen is the funniest thing to me. So I don't know. I mean, for the same reason, I mean, there's different kinds of humor, there's different kinds of laughter. And I was going for the kind of laughter that you do whenever you see something horrible unfold in front of you and your brain has to discharge it by laughing.
It's also a book that is incredibly intelligent and sort of mind-blowingly astute psychologically, like the way that you're able to inhabit the lives of a wide variety of characters with a wide variety of backgrounds, interests, genders, sexual orientation, you name it. Like I just felt like, wow, like this is a writer who's really in command and has been able to see deeply into people. You mentioned that you did research by reading like what? Like research papers by social scientists. Can you point to anything else that you did to build these characters in such a like dimensional and believable way?
Um, yeah, so it certainly didn't mostly come from scientific papers. I originally, I was thinking of the book as half fiction and half nonfiction. And I was even thinking about like maybe it could be like this ace double format where you flip the book over when you get halfway through and then you read the nonfiction part afterwards. But the fiction just ended up getting a lot longer. It was, more of an awkward fit to shoehorn it in. But the nonfiction part was where I was doing most of the research for like the kind of like library research. For the fiction, a lot of the feedback I've gotten is that people are impressed that I can write from the perspective of like a gay man or a woman, using details that might be hard to kind of invent from whole cloth. Like, so one detail in particular that has been quoted back to me a lot is this one line in the second story called Pix, which is about a woman named Allison who gets rejected by her best friend after like a one night stand. And she falls into this like deep depression. And there's a line that says, like, she's, when she goes to the bathroom, like, she doesn't bother to move her tampon string out of the way. So she just walks around all day with a damp string. And I got like this, like probably 60-40 response where 60%, of like my female friends who read it were like, how did you know that? And the other 40% is like, Tony, you need to take this out. This never happens. Or this is not plausible. And I'm like, really? Because like, like a lot of these details, where I got it from is just friends of mine, like just hearsay, people telling me stuff about their own lives. And I'm like, is it just like a fluke that this person, went through this and was talking about it? But, I, I brought this back to my friend, and they were like, let me go and text my girls group chat right now and see, what they think about this. And apparently there was like a big argument about, which one is the normal one to do. And I'm like, oh my God, this is just like when people were arguing about whether to fold or crumple toilet paper when they're wiping, and they didn't realize that the other, side of humanity existed. Even they thought everybody did the way that they did it. So, I mean, when it comes to stuff like that, to go back to your research question, it's like really important for me not to bullshit about that stuff, right? If I don't uh, really have firsthand experience of it, I'll do my best. I'll try to guess my way through it, but I'm always going to run it by somebody who would know, right? The same goes for the third story. Uh, I had a friend who's an editor do a really great sensitivity read of it that like helped me so much for writing the story.
I was going to ask
Yeah.
because I know sensitivity reads are increasingly a thing. I feel like that's really started happening more over the past decade than it did
Yeah.
previously. And for a book like this, I can imagine maybe that there would be a higher necessity for people to sort of vet the material. At the same time, it's kind of like intentionally over the top in its humor and like really dark.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be an easy read for some
Yeah.
people, and that's just the way that it's supposed to be.
Well, yeah. I mean, that story in particular, it's not that his sexuality is just an incidental fact about him. It really is at the center of the story. And it is also, the subject of comedy too. And so it's something that's really easy to fuck up and, treat in a way that's like sort of frivolous or, it's taking a laugh at the expense of the character that you're writing about. I think that, sensitivity reading has this, a bit of this sort of bad name in like, upper crust literary circles because it's got this kind of like DEI kind of, scent to it that it's just like, oh, why would you put this kind of like HR bureaucratic process into the process of making art? Shouldn't it just be from your own vision and your view of the world? Why would you compromise it through, other people's, sort of risk averse opinions about, how this a type of person should be portrayed? And I really think that's like maybe that's like the really bad sensitivity edits. I think that any form of bad editing can exist, but the really good ones are really just having research assistants, right? To be like, I have somebody who is an expert in a field of experience or knowledge that I don't. I want to listen to them and see what I can use, right? And so it's really not more complicated than that. And at the end of the day, there's no sensitivity read on earth that's going to shield you from being the one whose name is on the book and being accountable to that, right?
It just feels like due diligence.
Yeah. Right. Because like, again, you can guess and you can get things right sometimes. And a lot of writing, I think, is just prestidigitation. But I also think that like, yeah, why wouldn't you get more certainty, more information about the stuff you're writing about if you could?
And it's worth noting too that the writer has final cut. It's not
Yeah,
like the sensitivity reader gets to make editorial decisions unilaterally and you have
right.
to implement them.
It's actually in the contract. I was looking at sort of professional sensitivity readers before I decided to go with my friend, and they say like, we are not like accountable for the final product because ultimately that's your decision, and makes total sense, right? Because you could see people doing this, getting the sensitivity read, and then if they, come in for criticism, they would hide behind it, right? If there weren't that kind of like a stipulation.
So I want to talk to you about the structure of this book because as we've been discussing, it's a collection of linked stories. There was originally like a lot of nonfiction in it. It gets metafictional. It's pretty inventive, kind of formally. And I think that the structure and the sequence of the stories really is important in this book. There's a logic that you're building. I think there's a real intentionality to the structure and a lot of thought that went into it. And I think maybe the place that I'd like to start is with the first three stories, which to me function as a kind of cycle, like almost unto themselves. It's
Mhm.
like an exploration of rejection in three different iterations. Is that the right way to characterize it? But just to talk about, maybe just to use it as a way of talking about structure and the decisions you made around how to build a sequence.
Yeah. I mean, you're exactly spot on with that. Even in the way that I wrote them, those were the first three things, and I wrote them, the first drafts of them pretty much back to back, back in like 2011. They're really, really different back then and much shorter. But I was thinking about that trilogy of stories as, where I would hash out the romantic rejection stuff. They're from sort of different points of view, but they're also dealing about with different forms of rejection too. The feminist, which is the first story, is about somebody who gets rejected over and over again over the course of about 30 years. And it kind of zooms in the second story, with a single rejection and how somebody plays it out over about 1 year. And then the third one is not even really about a rejection. It's about somebody who is so terrified of rejection that they can't handle acceptance, right? That they end up ruining what might have been perfectly fine relationship because of their fear of rejection, right? So you're right in that there was this progression, but it's not conventional plot progress like you would see in a typical novel. It's more like thematic development, right? Where I'm trying to cover as much ground as possible in a kind of lateral way, instead of sort of moving from one event leading to the next.
I read where you said that in the same way that rejection itself is dialectical in nature, you throw yourself at something, it throws you back. I wanted each piece of the book to somehow refute the one before it, and in different ways each time.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's part of just kind of showmanship, right? I wanted to have an experience of reading it where you really didn't know what you were going to get the next time. It's the first two stories, back to back are like, oh, I didn't know this was going to be connected, fiction. Like this character from the first story is in the second one, and the third one's just like, oh, this one's not even about rejection. That's kind of different. And eventually I kind of quickly ran out of these like pivots that I could make within just like the sort of realm of straight fiction. So I started having to make formal turns, instead. And the whole thing is of a piece, and I was trying to, by the end of it, say everything that I wanted to say about rejection. I'm just doing it in this kind of like hopscotchy way where I'm using the openness of the structure, the fact that it's not a typical novel, it's not a typical story collection really, as part of the pleasure of reading it, which is that it frees me up to do whatever I want in the next story and then surprise the reader with it.
So, again, I want to read something you said, and I want to have you actually explain a little bit
Okay.
because this really struck me. You said, quote, the true rejection plot is the one the reject devises in the absence of a plot.
Hmm. Yeah, so that's from this long essay that I published in the Paris Review. And that's the bulk of that long nonfiction piece that I took out of the book, right? The essay is called The Rejection Plot. And, in that essay, I mean, it's really kind of rambling and freeform, but the basic point I'm trying to make is, outlining what the rejection plot is, as opposed to a marriage plot or a revenge plot, right? Usually, plots are popular because they have kind of built-in dramatic schemes, right? If someone in a revenge plot does something to you, it naturally causes this, reaction that is interesting to see develop. Are they going to get satisfaction or not? In a romance plot or marriage plot or whatever, it's like, will they or won't they get together, and how will that happen? Rejection is like a really difficult thing to write about because once it happens, it's over, right? Like, at least in the sense of, if outward events in the world happening, it shifts really quickly to this heavily interior process where you're second guessing, and you're growing bitter, and you're going through these like cycles in your head, and that's very hard to dramatize because there's so much repetition and so little action, right? So when I say that the true rejection plot is the one that the reject devises in the absence of a plot, it's that because nothing is happening, all the events are sort of happening in your head, right? That process we were talking about earlier, where I'm like, oh, well, I got rejected. Well, it must be because this person was thinking this about me. And here's what I think about that. And here's what I'm going to do about that thought, and so on and so forth. Right. But this is all, imaginary. This is all something that you're, sort of fabricating for yourself, usually for the purposes of solving your ego.
So, in a review by Gia Tolentino that I read, she talks about how you are interested in exploring not just the inward turn that rejection occasions, but also the way in which it can also occasion outward violence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly part of the collection. And it's about, I think she says, ultimately the mistake of seeking revenge. And as I read that, and as I was thinking about the book, it occurred to me how many violent crimes of note, like the kinds of violent crimes that make the news and that become part of the popular conversation, often have an element of rejection to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes it's a very central part of the story. In fact, maybe often it is, when somebody lashes out, or there's a school shooter, or there's some kind of act of terrorism perpetrated by an individual who has some kind of grudge. They've usually experienced a rejection at work. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, did that occur to you as you were writing this? Like, how
Oh,
much?
it not just occurred to me. I mean, I wrote about it at length. In that rejection plot essay, in the part about mass shooters, right? There is a really strong component of revenge in most of them, and it's not just usually this diffuse grievance to begin with. It is usually a specific rejection or set of rejections that gets fixated upon and grows into something else. So, like, thinking like you know Kip Kinkle, Michael Carneal, George Sodini, George Hennard, the Luby shooter. Most famously probably Elliot Rodger, people like that. And what was interesting to me about that, because like the general, like, oh, somebody becomes embittered and then wants to enact revenge by shooting people up, it at least sort of psychologically adds up. But when you think about it a little more, it gets really strange, because like in a lot of these shootings, the target of the shooting was not the person that they're holding the grudge against, right? In a lot of them, you'll see that, like, it's just an indiscriminate shooting at a shopping mall or at a diner or something like that. You would think that they would be more targeted to the specific people who had rejected them, which does happen, by the way. But in those cases where it doesn't, you have to wonder, like, how does it get from being rejected by one or a handful of people to just shooting up random people that have nothing to do with it, right? And again, in that sort of research I was doing, I was like, digging up papers about the psychology of mass shooters, and this term came up called entativity, which is this idea that when you been wronged by somebody or where you have a grievance against somebody, you're just more likely to see them as part of a larger group, and that entire group becomes your enemy, right? And obviously, this plays out in all kinds of ways. But when it comes to rejection specifically, you can see how this can be like, well, this particular person, this woman rejected me, and in almost all of these cases, by the way, it's like straight men doing this, right? And then it becomes all women, and then it becomes all of society that is complicit in this and needs to be punished in all of this, right? That's the level to which this sort of disaffection grows. But besides the rejection itself, nothing is happening. This is all happening in your head. That's where like I said, the rejection plot is at work. So in the same way that a plot unfolds in a conventional story, and one pretty minor thing can lead to something extremely dramatic at the end of it. The same thing is at work here. It's just invisible. It's just happening inside somebody's head.
Why do you think it is that straight men are the ones who often devolve into violence versus other people experiencing rejection?
I think that's a pretty straightforward case of like violence being the thing that is that we're told is going to affirm masculinity, right? That like you know if you can physically beat somebody or even like kill them or whatever, that is the sort of proof of your dominion over them. And yeah, it's a message that we're sort of given from a pretty young age, and there's not really any default course out of it. It starts to become something that is like lionized in certain fields, and yeah, it's something that has to be consciously resisted in order to escape.
In the writing of this book and the associated reading that you did you come across any common denominators for like women or gay or non-binary people in terms of how they handle rejection? Is there any through line?
Um, I mean, one thing that I found was actually there's just not that much research about rejection. Period. I mean, I did read a lot of papers, but I still think that there's just a long way to go about it. But most of the papers I saw kind of did a lot of generalization about just like, well, this is how people of a certain age cohort experience it. I have to say I didn't read that much into like the science or the scientific surveys about like demographic specific rejection.
It's interesting to me to hear you talk about writing this essay and doing all the nonfiction work that you did that ultimately didn't make it into the book, because I think it's there. It's buried in the text somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no such thing as wasted effort when you're doing things, in service of your book. You can write a whole chapter that you end up cutting, but the having to work through the voice in that chapter in the process of writing it is going to help the rest of the book, right? And the same way, it's just going to make you, if you do things like scientific research or whatever, it's going to give you just like more confidence about the psychology of what is and is not plausible for a person in a specific situation. Now, of course, like you can't really go just by research, and a lot of what makes characters psychologically like rich or interesting or mysterious is that they're unpredictable, right? That they go against what a statistically typical person in that situation would do. So you can't let it completely over determine what you're writing, but it is a factor in all.
Well, and this is just such a crystalline, powerful, beautifully written, and like to my eye, like fully realized work of fiction. And it's sort of heartening to hear that the process was messy. It took a long time. You thought it was going to be one thing and then it became another. You wrote entire sections of the book in a different mode, but that's just the process. That's
Yeah.
what you have to go through to get to the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a lot of ways, I think it still is messy. Like, uh, when I was talking to my agent and editor in the process of selling it, what I wasn't sure if the fiction and nonfiction parts would stay in, you know, we ran into the problem of like there's not really a name for a book that's short fiction and a long essay, and it is kind of a chimerical book in that way. But at the same time, I also think that this is why we have novels. That novels are called novels for a reason. It's because they innovate on the form of storytelling, and I don't think that there's any compelling reason why a novel can't have a substantial, nonfiction part, or be part metafiction and part fiction, or have a random, weird, short, lyric essay, right near the end of it, and into different degrees, the book does all of those things.
So, was the book rejected in the marketplace?
No, my first book was by everybody but one publisher. And this one was the same publisher, and they, bought the book on a preempt.
Okay, so it wasn't part of a 2-book deal. You did have to go to the market with it.
Yeah, but there was like a clause in my first contract that they got the first look at the next book I had, and they wanted it. So
that's kind of funny that a book called Rejection was not rejected.
Well, in the process of trying to publish parts of it before the book came out, there was definitely plenty of rejection there. Actually, back when Tin House was publishing its like literary magazine, they had a rejection themed issue, and I submitted really early versions of like the first 2 stories to it, and they were both rejected. And I'm like, that's perfect.
Well, but wait, now The Feminist was ultimately published by N+1,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the most read work of fiction in the history of N+1.
Yeah, I think they published like a list of the 20 most read pieces in their history, and it was the only piece of fiction that was on there.
So it was in the top 20.
It was number 2, yeah.
Okay. So with that happening, and this is pre-publication, you put this little bit of your book out into the world, and there is that kind of response. That had to feel good. Did it affirm to you that you were onto something, and that you were speaking about something that had like a real relevance?
I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to tell, because the things that make a story go viral are not necessarily what make them good, right? Very often it is like a content thing. There's a perception of relevance or timeliness to it. And, I'm certainly not timing anything to, any sort of like cycle of cultural relevance. You can't do that when you're working, 8+ years on something. So, I chalked it up at the time to being like, well, it is sort of, adjacent to a lot of the sort of Me Too discourse in literature coming out at the time. It might have just been like a sort of happy coincidence in that sense. So I also just tried to, in the same way that I've had to inure myself to rejection, I tried to inure myself to praise and acceptance too, because it can sort of knock you into a really dark place if you really go after it and you let that drive, what it is you're writing, or how you're writing. Then again, that this sort of devolves to pandering eventually.
So I want to talk a little bit about being a slow writer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a slow writer. I think that being a slow writer is sometimes denigrated unfairly. I think there's actually virtue, or that it can lead to good things to work slowly. And again, I'm going to quote you to yourself, where you have said, part of why I take a long time to write is because I'll write something and then return to it in a couple of weeks or months and not like it anymore. I feel like if I spend a long enough time on something, then it time proofs it a little bit. But the problem with that is I'm always updating, and those updates have ramifications elsewhere in the book. It's miserable.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with me. I think that, yeah, part of the infuriating thing about working on something that you're almost conceiving as this sort of single unitary product at the end of it, with like one correct version that you're aspiring towards, is a really damaging way of going about it, because it's a moving target. Both the project that you think that you're working on and your own sensibilities as a writer are constantly evolving. So even if you did a good job of what you were trying to do 3 years ago, you might not even like that anymore, right? So I think that, in order to kind of ward off despair for my students when I tell them this, I do think that there is this kind of asymptotic process, by which, you don't ever actually hit exactly the thing, this ideal form of a book. It's really more like there are multiple acceptable forms of the book that can exist, and you're, with every revision, getting 50% of the way there, right? And that 50% gets, smaller and smaller until, you know it's pretty much there, right? That the difference between where you're at and what you were really going for is, infinitesimal, right? So yeah, but I think that, like, again, it can only hurt you while you're writing, to be tempted into being like, well, this got a good response from people, and I'm going to lead in that direction because, it's almost like a Pascal's wager, right? If you like tried to pander and then it doesn't even succeed in doing that, then you don't even get the satisfaction of doing what you set out to do, right? But you're always going to at least, accomplish your artistic goals if you're really trying to write what you want to write.
So I want to talk with you about technology and I guess you're a millennial, your generation. You're often characterized as a millennial writer and a writer who has like a particularly keen insight into your own cohort. Is that something you accept or reject?
I mean, it's honestly a accurate and much better label than a lot of other labels that could be applied to me. So, if only to run interference, I think I'm fine with it.
It's impossible to avoid noticing in reading your book how attached to the internet and their devices the characters in this book are, as like most of us are in life these days. I'm interested in hearing you talk about your views on like modern technology and rejection. Has modern technology changed it in any kind of fundamental way, made it worse, made it easier? Like that was stuff that was on your mind as you were writing this, no?
Not really in any way, except for, how can I use the internet to, play around with form. I think that, from the sociological standpoint, right? Like, I'm going to say something about internet culture. Again, it's one of those top-down ways of thinking about it that always, leads you in the wrong direction. To me, it's just realism, right? At least, for me and people I know, we spend a really grotesque amount of time, like, on, the phone, or just, random websites, like, social media or Reddit or whatever. And so, especially for a set of characters that are extremely isolated and extremely, desperate and in search of answers that are for questions that are too, embarrassing to ask other human beings in person, it makes a sort of natural setting for that, right? And if, very much unlike Private Citizens, which was very much like a San Francisco novel and a novel of place, I left a lot of like the identifying geographic details suppressed in this book. There's like one story that's, definitely set in San Francisco and New York, but other than that, it's been deliberately muted, and so you could say that, the setting really is the internet. But yeah, I was definitely never thinking like, what do I want to say about the internet? I was just trying to write in a pretty, for the first three stories, like a pretty conventional realist mode. And, realism these days just entails a lot of, phone using.
Yeah, I mean, I heard you say earlier that some of the pieces in the book were written, what, 2011, 2012, 2013, so a good while ago, and that initially they were much shorter.
Yeah.
So that makes me wonder what you added. I'm also now thinking in the context of our discussion about technology, how the stories and how the book might have changed as technology changed.
Yeah. One thing that is always said about the challenges of like writing about the internet is that it's like so fast moving. The platforms that people are on may not be there anymore in 10 years. It'd be like writing about MySpace and then MySpace, going under. I'm not really that concerned about that. I think that there are distinctive, eras to the internet, and so, you know, if the fate of every realist novel eventually is to become historical fiction, it's just part of that process, right? I would read a novel that was set in MySpace, even though MySpace isn't around anymore. I would read, a novel where people are using horse and buggy, even though those aren't around anymore. I don't really see what the problem is. I think that the where people run into problems is like, they're worried that it's going to become dated. And what dates a book is not whether the technology that is mentioned in the book is still current. It's whether or not the situations people find themselves in have the same sort of presumptive relevance to a reader in a different era, which has everything to just do with writing compelling characters and plot and action and things like that.
So along these like technological lines, I want to share another line from the review by Gia Tolentino because it really hit me and said, in a much more articulate way, something that I was kind of feeling as I was reading. She says, quote, "Together, the stories in Rejection form a case study in the way that the internet has both popularized structural language about power and also flattened all sense of proportion, meaning, and historicity. Being online can swiftly amplify a personal feeling of rejection into a worldview, a convincing theory that the universe is conspiring to shit specifically on the micro demographic of you. Rejection, your book, captures with alarming fluency the way that language built for social justice can easily be repurposed."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that a big part of it is writing about ideology in a way, or the uses people have for ideology. You know, if the kind of provocative issue at hand for like the feminist, for example, is like, how can a guy who purports to be doing everything for the welfare of women then go in and shoot up a restaurant because in part to avenge himself, ideologically on feminism. It's because he took a personal grievance and he connected it to an imagined struggle against a society that, I mean, the funny and really dark joke at the end of that story is that he still considers himself like the real feminist in all of this, that it's everybody else who's failed feminism or feminism has failed them. But it's because ideology is like this tool as well as a lens, and it can be availed to any number of purposes, right? You can imagine, in some kind of totalitarian society, somebody snitching out their neighbor on ideological grounds, but it's just because they have like an axe to grind with them, right? And not because they really believe in the complaint that they're lodging. So, people can use this stuff in all kinds of ways, and usually you hear it as things like identity or social justice language being weaponized, right? But it's if it's a weapon, it's a double-edged sword, right? That buying into it that deeply can sort of constrain your sort of sense of generosity or your acknowledgments of the sort of complexity of other people's inner lives, uh, because you have some kind of self-serving purpose.
So another component of like the technological aspect of the book is Twitter. I have to bring it up because there's a passage in the book that kind of like took my breath away. It was such a beautiful like unpacking of Twitter and like what it is and how it functions and why its impact is so deep. And I would just love to talk with you about it a little bit, because Twitter, like social media in general, has been kind of like a burr in my saddle for a long time. Like I'm not good at it, and yet I'm always on it, and I don't like it, and yet I'm reading it and I
Yeah.
find it useful. And it's like this very complicated soup, but
Twitter and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race.
you think so?
No, I'm just quoting Ted Kaczynski there.
Oh,
Um,
oh, I mean, listen, I'm not sure if he's wrong. I mean, I feel like social media has its virtues, but like if we're thinking about rejection as like a human phenomenon in particular, it's undeniable that a site like Twitter allows people to share their craziness in an unvarnished way, and to attack one another,
yeah.
and to say things to one another that would never be said in polite society. Like that's part of what it has done to us.
Yeah. When your only access to another person is a tiny little bit of text and maybe some images or videos, that you're getting, almost like an IV drip into your eyeballs, like every, a couple of days, and you disagree with them, you form, there's a gestalt in the human mind, whatever, that forms an idea of what that person is and what they represent, and you want to deal with them accordingly. Either they're like it's you can develop this parasocial, crush or obsession with them, or you can, see them as an avatar for everything that's wrong with the world. And yeah, it's very easy to instrumentalize other people on it. But to your point about people saying and doing odious things on there, I mean, just from the perspective of like a nosy fiction writer who's curious about the limits of human nature, that's a real banquet. It is amazing to see what people will do or say there. But the thing is, like, the real mistake with engaging with this stuff at all is to see it as a genuine, disinterested expression of what people really think, or what they're really like, right? Because like everything else, it's just a performance with its own incentives and prerogatives, right? you know People say uh, incendiary stuff all the time to provoke a response and juice their engagement, to get followers, right? Because there are real concrete reasons why that benefits. To say nothing of just like the psychological, addiction that's been designed by like the people who made these platforms, to just validation and affirmation and visibility, right? So I think that there, and also the fact that like you also don't even know who these people are. You might be arguing with a 14-year-old on there, right? Which is why I just don't do it. And uh, yeah, it's that veiling of other people on there that makes it so volatile. But yeah, again, for a novel writer, that's all really good fodder for dramatic material. On the one hand, it's difficult because you don't get to do things like describe bodies and actions and things like that. But there's a different kind of drama at work there.
Well, some of the best passages in the book, I should say, kind of unfold, not necessarily on Twitter, but in this kind of disembodied digital space. I'm thinking of like the group chats in particular. The group chat as a phenomenon
Yeah.
is interesting. I haven't seen it done a ton. I've seen a lot of text exchanges, but I don't know if I've seen group chat done as much as maybe it should be done, because it's very common. I think
Yeah.
everybody's got at least one or two group chats on their phone, and they are often a repository for some of the funniest writing in your book, but also I think in life. Like, what is it about a group chat that seems to
Oh, it's
foment
that they're
this?
private, right? And you are also still performing there, right, for other people. But there is much higher presumption of goodwill in a group chat, and trust that makes people, well, and also a desire to gratify the other people in the group chat, that makes it just a great venue for comedy and venting, right? And just being kind of artful about it. I think that there's, I can't think off the top of my head of other stories with group chats in them, but there's definitely a lot of dialogue driven, internet fiction. Like, right behind me, there's this book, Several People Are Typing by Kelvin Gasulki, one of my students. And it's entirely set in Slack, which is even more specific than, a group chat. And, it's just really fun working within it to be like, well, it's dialogue fundamentally, but it's got its own sort of, typography and syntax and rules and pace. That's really fun to play with when you're used to the more conventional stuff.
Yeah, you clearly have like mastery of it. I never doubted it, and like the emojis and the whole thing. It's its own kind of language. And
Yeah, the emojis like almost drove the book designers to suicide.
I can imagine, right?
They didn't actually have a standard at HarperCollins for doing emoji reactions to text messages. Like they had to design the bubble that was attached to, like, when you want a thumbs up, somebody's like message. And also, like, there was no single font that contained all of the different characters that I was using. So they had to like Frankenstein together like a bunch of different typefaces.
So kudos to the book designer.
Yeah, salute.
It's making me think too, as I ponder like social media and the digital part of it all, how rejection is kind of embedded into the process of tweeting. Like there's a kind of irony because for me, I think the more common experience is that I put something up and nobody responds, or like two people are like, yay, and you just feel like there's like kind of an inherent rejection that happens a lot, right? Because the more you post and the more that happens, I think some of us go through this multiple times a day, and it's come to be like a part of life. The flip, and I've had this thought, is to be a person who has a huge and like rabid and really engaged following, so that no matter what you say, there's all this reciprocity. Because, I'll look sometimes and somebody will post something that I think is pretty pedestrian, and they'll have like 7,000 likes and like a million comments, and people are so invested in every single word that this person says and just like so ready to clap for them. And that would be its own kind of like dopamine and overload and weird terrain to exist in, right? And its own kind of addiction. But I think too, when you have a feed like that, then maybe you're more open to the kinds of like verbal attacks and trolls and like mean-spirited and cruel feedback than I would be. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that, I don't get
Yeah.
that. I don't get like the mean-spirited trolls. The trolls don't even bother with me. But do you know what I'm saying? Like it's like one or the other, but neither one is completely free of like feeling a sense of, I guess, rejection or defeat.
Yeah. I mean, I think I get it. I mean, if you're frustrated in general, or you're frustrated by a particular piece of content you see online, it's, trolling somebody is basically like punching a pillow or something. It's just that it so happens that inside of the pillow is like someone's face, right? So, I understand that on that level, but I think that people, uh, it's hard to be misled about exactly what constitutes like online interaction. So when you like, hit a like on somebody's tweet, the overt purpose of it is to be like, I liked what you said, right? But that is not actually what that means most of the time. And it can mean, 20 different things. You could do the thing where you like, every single tweet someone's done for the last month because you're like, I want to get this person's attention, right? Or you could like something because you're like, I just want to look at it later and it'll be in my likes thing. Or I want to like this because I think it affirms a belief I have and it should have more visibility, right? Even if it is, pretty pedestrian. It's something that I would like to say, but for some reason I'm too timid to where I don't have as big a following, so it wouldn't, land as hard or whatever. So it could, really be any of these number of things, but they all get kind of routed through this one incredibly, obtuse form of interaction, right? And that's just likes. So, I think that, yeah, it really boggles the mind to scale it up and to be like, you know, when 7,000 people decided to hit the like button, like on this post, why did they do it? Right. Because then you have to come up with 7,000 answers for that. And, for the most people, who are, aiming for that kind of a response, they don't trouble themselves too much with that. They're just going to go with like, this kind of content gets a lot of play. I'm going to do more of it. Right. And this goes back to our point about, pandering earlier on. It's hard to criticize, too roundly, just because, you know, uh, sometimes you have a message to put out there, or sometimes it benefits you, professionally, or you even depend on it professionally. But it is a really dark and alienating place to be in, to put yourself at the mercy of those likes, right?
But you're active on social media too, right? I mean,
Yeah, but I'll just post any dumb bullshit.
I can't.
I'm in it for the love of the game. I've been on Twitter since March 2007. You can see it right in the profile. I was posting, you know, way back, in the days of having, 80, 90 followers or whatever, and continue to post today. It's not, a guarantee that I'll keep doing it. Just that, no one's made me stop yet.
And you're able to just like turn off whatever filter or like critical, like self-critical lens that you might see your stuff through and just post bullshit. Like that's the thing I struggle with is I never know what to say.
Yeah, I mean, I have a real strict compartmentalization between, forms of expression where I really try to mean what I'm saying, and the ones where I'm not. Right, I'm almost always availing myself of like some degree of irony, whenever I say anything, but it's ramped up, almost all the way completely online for the most part, unless I'm like, oh, here's like a fundraiser or a bit of news that I just want to share or whatever. Yeah. Other than that, I did an event with a writer, like a pretty well known writer, who had read my book and said that she was a fan of it. And then we went out to dinner afterwards, whatever. And she told me, like, Tony, I was just like I have to tell you, I was so impressed by your book, Private Citizens. And, it had all these like layers of just like complexity and irony to it. And then I went on your Twitter and I'm like, man, maybe you're not that smart after all. And I'm like, to me, that's part of the point. The point of the freedom of being able to just emit noise, and to say something that is like, so dumb that it is funny again, is just enjoyable to me, right? But I don't know. I don't even want to say that like I'm very good at it, or that I've even been doing as much recently. I'm mostly just reposting other things I think are funny these days. But um, I, if you can treat it as this like exercise in being like, there's a joy in expression, and that's what I'm availing myself of here. That's probably the best way to go about it without, you know, being seduced by all these other temptations of like, what you can get from being, well known online.
So I'm curious to know what your experience has been as Rejection has made its way into the world. The reviews have been pretty great, at least, from what I've seen. What has your experience of that been like? Also, what have you been hearing from readers?
Yeah, I mean, I've been pretty like shocked by the response because, my earlier experience is a pretty typical experience of, publishing a novel. It sells a couple thousand copies. You're on book tour for like 2 3 months, and then you publish a piece every now and then you're just, back to your life, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot that's changed about my life, other than the money that I got from like the book deal, which is, not insignificant at all. But it is definitely a total sea change in the way that people are engaging with my work and what I'm hearing about it. Right. It's been mostly praise, and I never know what to do about that. I'm very bad at accepting compliments because on one level there's just a knee-jerk skepticism, especially living in New York, of people who are just fluffing you up because they want to get in your good graces because of whatever boost in prestige or visibility that you have, and so you try to take a measured view of that. But I have gotten some really like moving messages from people, and messages from people that just like shocked would have heard of me, right? That not just the book reviewers, but just like the other day, like Saint Vincent said it was like her favorite book of the year, and Bo Yang was like posting about it and stuff, and I'm like, wow, that's real culture. What are they doing talking about me,
Yeah.
right? I'm being ironic, of course. Books are real culture. It's just that uh, that is you don't usually see yourself as engaging in the same game as people with true mass media audiences, right? That even the most successful fiction writers are not really going to get recognized in the grocery store, except for we're talking like Stephen King level writers. So even this kind of like relative to that modest burst of like attention has honestly been kind of exhausting. Like you work in obscurity for a really long time, and it's not something I particularly like covet. This sort of hypervisibility. I usually turn down most requests to do anything on video, except for this podcast and a couple of other things because I like them. And uh, yeah, I've always found myself very alienated from like image culture and mass discourse. So to find myself at least glancingly the subject of it is weird. That's all I'll say.
Well, it's well deserved. It's a really, really good book and really funny. Like I haven't laughed out loud reading a book as I did with this one in a while. And it also, in a very admirable way, takes a lot of creative risks and yet pulls it off. It's like this feeling of watching somebody walk a high wire. That was kind of the sensation that I had while reading it. So kudos to you.
Oh, thank you.
Do you have anything else in the works? That's what I always end with when I'm talking to somebody. I know that you kind of work slowly, so maybe you're just kind of like beginning to germinate. Hopefully something is going to come quicker, or no?
Yeah, I mean, my usual process is that I just sit around with an idea or a couple of ideas in my head, and then I'm in just total denial about it for 2 or 3 years because I'm like, that's a really stupid idea and I don't want to do that. And then I do it eventually. So I'm in that germination denial phase right now. You don't even really know. There's not like a kind of elevator pitch I could give of it. So that's probably way distant in the offing, although I'm hoping that I can write, more quickly this time. I also have this other book that I was working on between like 2012 and 2017. That was like it's like 70% done, and it is insanely different than either of the other two books I've written. It's like a book of weird experimental criticism. Um, that's like it's a if you've ever read like Stanislaw Lem or Borges when he's like writing reviews of books that don't exist. It's sort of like the inverse of that. So it's like what if you wrote criticism about stuff that exists, but from a fictional vantage point that does not exist, right? Like, so I've published a couple of these already. Like, there's one essay about Bruce Lee and specifically the movie The Game of Death that I wrote, and it just kind of mutated in this weird direction where all of a sudden, like halfway through, you realize that the critic lives in a world where mummies exist. And he's just like, yeah, it's so interesting how this movie uses mummies, and just kind of goes on from there and to formulate a cinematic theory of like mummies. And I sort of based this on a story my friend Bennett Sims wrote, and he was influenced in turn by this critic named Jalal Tufik. So anyway, I brought this to my agent, and she was like, I do not want to sell this. I'm like, fair enough. Okay, maybe I'll just like, leak it and it'll just be, Sami's dot or something. But it's a really, really weird project. It's not funny, and I'm not sure it is readable either.
But it might just exist online in like pieces, or do you think that?
Yeah, I don't know. I might pull a Helen DeWitt and just put it in a PDF or something.
What about the ideas that are percolating? You said that when a book project starts for you, it starts as an idea that you kind of sit with for a couple years in denial. Can you give any hints as to what ideas you're entertaining?
No. I don't want to commit myself to anything publicly that I'm going to have to, follow through on later. But I'll say that, the last times this happened were with these like the last two books where I was like, Private Citizens, I'm like, no, please, I cannot be writing a novel about 420 somethings in the city. Like, especially, publishing in 2016 after, Girls was almost over. I'm like, but eventually I just came around. Actually, my friend Karin was like, you just have to admit that you're writing a novel. Just write what you can write. And, that was, it's good advice. I mean, there's no such thing as exhausting a genre. There's such a thing as overexposing or oversaturating one. But if you do a good job of it, then hopefully, people will like it in spite of that. And yeah, with Rejection, again, a lot of really unpleasant subject matter for me to have to dwell on, much less like publicize, right? So didn't want to do it for a long time, but I'm like, this is all I got. And, you have to just write what you can write.
All right. Well, it has been a pleasure to talk with you. And I feel like we've come a long way because we talked in the wake of the publication of Private Citizens in my old filthy garage. You're one of the lucky few who got to experience that magic.
That's right. Yeah. And I want to apologize to you and the listeners of Otherppl, the longtime listeners, for being galactically hungover for that chat. I think I went to a really dark place in that conversation.
Honestly, I'd have to re-listen to it. I never had it in my head that you were hungover like that. That wasn't something that occurred to me, or I don't think you told me when you were there. It didn't seem like you were hungover. And
yeah, I think in the episode description, you were like, "This guy's really intense."
You're like, I'm just hanging on for dear life. Well, now I'm in a cleaner garage, and you are talking to me after going to the gym. So, I think maybe we're both improving. Maybe.
All right. Yes, growing.
Well, it's nice to see you, and big congrats on Rejection. It's a really excellent book.
Thank you. It's great talking to you.
All right, folks, there we go. That was today's conversation with Tony Tulathimutte. His new novel in stories is called Rejection, available from William Morrow and Company. For more on Tony and his work, visit tonytula.com. Follow him on social media, Twitter, Bluesky, and Instagram. One more time, the book is called Rejection. It is outstanding. Go get it right away. Don't forget to subscribe to the Otherppl podcast wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on social media if you so desire, TikTok, Bluesky, and Instagram. You can sign up for my weekly email newsletter over at Substack, and you can join the Otherppl Patreon community over at patreon.com/OtherPPLpod. To join the Otherppl book club or to get an Otherppl t-shirt or a hoodie, just head on over to the show's official website, otherppl.com. If you have 2 minutes, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. Rate it, review it. It helps the show in the algorithm, and it helps the show find new listeners. Last but not least, I have a book out. I have several books out. My most recent book is a novel. It's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, and it is available in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook. If that sounds good, go get it, read it, or have me read it to you. It's your choice. Again, it's a novel. It's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. All right, so coming up on Thursday, I will be back with Mira Gonzalez for the special holiday episode of Brad and Mira for the Culture. Are you ready? Stay tuned.